I'm delighted to be with you today, Ernie. I have so many questions. I think the first one would be, would you like to say something about your previous experience before coming to UCSD? And I'm sure you had some interesting experiences when you first came. Can you tell me some of them today?
Well, like many of us who came to UCSD in those early days, in 1960, for example, and I came in the fall of 1966. But we came to do one thing, ended up doing something else, and that was not uncommon in those early days because it was a very small campus. But my previous experience was primarily at Ohio State University, where I served as a campus minister. And I got recruited to come to this campus because I had colleagues at UC Berkeley and at UCLA and at Santa Barbara who ran similar kinds of student centers. And so my whole background was primarily in campus ministry, doing student development and training and spending a lot of time doing counseling and advising of undergraduate students. And that's what brought me to UCSD in the fall of 1966, September 8th to be exact. And I showed up, I had a little apartment down in La Jolla Shores, and I showed up one foggy evening on around, I think, September 9th, 1966. And my goodness, I walked onto the campus and all I could see were 6 brownstone residence halls and with students studying and a cafeteria, 3 buildings at the Central Library, and at that time was on Revelle, a big plaza, an undergraduate science building, Urey Hall, and David and Bonner Hall. And in the back, in the far left side of the campus, I could see a gymnasium, and that was it. And I thought, my goodness, what a small campus. I had just come from Ohio State where they had 25,000 students. And I stopped in the next day at a little side of the cafeteria, and there was a bookstore. And I picked up a handbook, and it was put out by students in Beagle Hall, one of the residence halls. And for heaven's sakes, I counted the number of students, and there was 1,200 students, about 1,000 undergraduates, and 250 graduate students, and that was it. And so then I just proceeded to start meeting some people on campus. I stopped in to see Dr. Hugh Bradner, who was that time the provost at Revelle College. And he gave me a very good rundown about the nature of the campus, and particularly of Revelle College, which was the first college at UCSD. And he suggested I go over and see the chancellor, and which I did. And I was surprised. His name was John Galbraith, a very distinguished professor of literature who became the second chancellor at UCSD. And he asked a little bit about what my experience was, and I told him I spent most of my life at Ohio State as a director of a student center and doing a lot of counseling, and he was very pleased to hear that, and he welcomed me, and then in the course of our discussion, he talked a lot about the campus and the history, and that was very interesting to me because I really knew very little at that point about UC San Diego. And we've just hired a new dean of students, George Murphy, who had just come down from Berkeley. And he was the first campus-wide dean of students. So I sat down with Dean Murphy, and he was delighted that I had come. And I told him that I was interested in working with students, serving as an advisor, doing some counseling, and helping to establish campus ministers to the campus, and which I did for about 2 years. And that's when I really began to understand a little bit about the nature of the campus, which was a total public campus, public university. And I had a wonderful colleague at that time, Pastor John Huber, who was the pastor of the local Lutheran community. And he was very helpful. He preceded me by about a year. And we worked together doing some courses in religious studies, which was my background through extension. And I volunteered to serve as an advisor to the associated students and did a lot of those things. I became a president of the La Jolla Ministerial Association and basically recruited help from the local Presbyterian, Methodist, congregational churches in La Jolla to be of help to our students, to provide special services for them. And so one thing led to another. But in the course of it, and this is somewhat retrospective at this point, I really came to know a lot about Dr. Roger Revelle, who, when I came, was not here, was not at UCS San Diego, he was at Harvard. And that's a long story that I'll get into a little bit later. But Dr. Revelle was certainly the founder of UCSD, and I want to say a few words about him because he was an extraordinary person. He had the vision of starting a new campus in San Diego. And he started talking about it as early as 1956. And he went to the La Jolla Town Council and talked about it to some people who were a little doubtful about whether that was a good idea or not. And then he got to know several of the very important people in San Diego, in the council particularly, and talked about the importance of starting a new campus at UC San Diego. And the timing was a very interesting period in the history at that time. From 1955 to about 1966, there was a huge ingrowth of population to California. And that had an enormous effect. There was discussions about setting up a master plan for the University of California and for all of the campuses in California at the time. It's called the Master Plan for Higher Education. And in that master plan, they talked about starting perhaps 3 new campuses at the University of California, increasing the number of state colleges, and almost doubling the number of community colleges. It was an enormous effort that started in Sacramento. And then to complicate, and this is something that Roger often talked about, and not only was there this whole interest in developing more schools in California of higher education, but also Sputnik went up in 1957, and that had a tremendous effect. Our first chancellor was the advisor to Eisenhower, and he played a very important role in encouraging the development of UC San Diego. And so by 1957, Dr. Roger Revelle got from the people of San Diego a very large portion of land, 356 acres of Pueblo lands, Spanish colonization. And during that period, there was a great interest in starting a new campus, and it was all because of Roger Revelle. And that was what really led to starting the new campus, which really, the regents finally in 1959 did go ahead and authorize the beginning of the campus.
That's interesting. Would you comment on the college system at UCSD? Does it differ in any way from other college systems?
Well, yes, it does, and it is unique, a part of the campus at UC San Diego. Now, Roger Revelle was interested primarily in developing a research university, but as an undergraduate, he had gone to Pomona College, one of the Claremont colleges, and he was very impressed with that. He thought that was a great idea because in addition, there was not only Pomona College, there was Scripps College, which was funded by the Scripps family. And Ellen Revelle, his wife, his future wife, was a student at Scripps College. They met at a Valentine's dance, I think, sometime around 1925, 26, when Roger entered Pomona, the campus, and is the one who really developed the idea not only of having a first-rate research university, but within that university, a series of colleges, small liberal arts colleges, which was extraordinarily different from Berkeley, UCLA, or most public universities. They generally have a big college of letters and science. What Roger opted for was at least six smaller colleges. Each would be a part of the university, but they would, and his experience at Pomona College had a lot to do with his idea about having liberal arts colleges within a university. And he had gone to Pomona as an undergraduate from 1925 to 1929, and he thought that was a good idea to have a college, and then he'd gone to Berkeley as a graduate student and in geology. And while he was at Berkeley, he was recruited to come down to Scripps Institution of Oceanography. And that is where he did all of his work, got his doctorate at Scripps through the UC Berkeley. And it was during that period, his idea, his vision, was to recruit the faculty first. And he recruited this extraordinary group of faculty, like Harold Urey and Maria Mayer and David Bonner. They were extraordinarily important people. Maria Mayer was a Nobel laureate, as was Dr. Urey. And so he brought the faculty first, housed them at Scripps, and then the graduate students, and lastly, the undergraduates. And that isn't the way a university normally starts. You start with a small number of undergraduates and build up. And Roger did it just the other way around. He was criticized for it. He felt that, many felt that that was going too quickly and to be too expensive. But it turned out to be a great stroke of good luck, because it meant that he brought a faculty in, it got known, and there were graduate students. And so the undergraduate system of colleges started in 1964 with Revelle College. It was named after Roger. And as I say, he invited this extraordinary group of faculty. And I want to start, first of all, with a photograph of Mrs. Revelle, who took a very active role in helping Roger recruit the faculty. She was the one who hosted them in La Jolla when they came. And she continued to be very involved at UC San Diego right up until a couple of years ago when she passed away. And, but she was really quite an extraordinary person. Harold Urey certainly played a very important role and took part in our commencements and was a very delightful person. He was very accessible to students. Often went to the Revelle cafeteria and invited students to join him around the table. And so that was a wonderful experience for those early students to get to know these extraordinary faculty like Maria Mayer and David Bonner, who started biology department. So that was kind of the nature of the system that was set up. And Roger served as director of Scripps from 1950 to 1960. But then in 1961, he was not chosen as the first chancellor. Herbert York was, who was the science advisor to Eisenhower. And Herbert York was if there was a co-founder to UCSD beside Roger, it probably would have been Herbert York, because he is the one who is credited with putting the campus together in those early days. It was Roger had the vision, the concept, but it was Herbert York who had to see to it that the college system could be implemented and that it could be brought within a structure. He had to put up the buildings initially for the first 3 colleges and for the university itself. He presided, I think, as chancellor from 1961 to about 1964. And then John Galbraith became the second chancellor at UCSD.
I'm sure UCSD has grown since then. How large is UCSD now?
Well, it's grown tremendously large. It's now 30,000 students. And instead of having just one college, when I came, there are now 6 undergraduate colleges. And so altogether, there's about 25,000 undergraduate students at UCSD, which we now call UC San Diego. And then there's 6 professional schools as well. There is the Division of Graduate Students, which makes up about 5,000 students. Of course, the Institution of Scripps Institution of Oceanography, a medical school, a school of pharmacy, and a school of international relations and Pacific studies, and another professional school, the Rady School of Management. So altogether, that makes up UC San Diego. It's now become a big campus. There's no question about it, and still growing. Whether there will be a seventh college is still in the planning stages. We're not sure, but that probably will end it in terms of the colleges within the university.
When Roger Revelle formed the campus, I'm sure there were political problems.
Well,
Can
there
you
were. There were political problems with that Roger ran into. First of all, the people in La Jolla were not terribly wild about the idea of starting a new campus, particularly in the late 50s. There was huge problems at Berkeley, if you remember. The student protests in Sproul Plaza caused a lot of alarm to a lot of students. It was on television. The students realized that at that time, the University of California had a policy that students should not engage in political or religious advocacy of any kind. And well, students did, but they did that privately and quietly. But if they were to go out into the public areas of UC Berkeley, like Sproul Plaza, they were not supposed to start engaging in politics as students. And so there was a whole question about freedom of speech. And so what started at Berkeley in the free speech movement was that coalition of student groups, some of them who wanted their rights to free speech. There were anti-war groups. There was a Corps of International Relations with regard to discrimination. So it was a coalition of student groups that grew into what is called the free speech movement. And that went on from 53 to 55. And so people in La Jolla were rightly worried that, that La Jolla Shores would end up like Telegraph Avenue at Berkeley. Well, that never happened, but Roger had to assure them. Plus, he also incurred some criticism from the chairman of the Board of Regents, one Edwin Pauley, who felt that the university was expanding much too quickly. He was quite conservative and had questions about whether that was the appropriate thing to do, that it might be better to expand the university at Riverside and Santa Barbara and UCLA before launching a new campus. So he was very much a critic. And when Roger's name came up for as the first chancellor, then they appointed Herbert York, who was a good friend of Dr. Revelle, who at that time was a science advisor to Eisenhower, and played a very important role in getting more institutions across the country, developing more colleges, particularly in engineering and aerospace especially.
Well, can students express themselves on social and political matters? And if they can, how do they do that?
Well, we were fortunate in that all the protests initially took place at Berkeley. And so the whole area of the matter of whether students had a right to express their political opinions, that was resolved. And what the regents decided to do, I think, as early as 1955, was to, in every area of the campus, they would designate a free speech area. And so the Revelle Plaza became became a free speech area. But students had a right to go out in terms of time, place, and manner was the rule, that they could go out and campaign to protest about free speech or about the Vietnam War that was beginning to take place. And so they had a right to do that. And normally the protests and rallies took place between 11:30 to 1:30. And that was considered, in terms of time, place, and manner, the appropriate thing to do. And I must say, in those early days, the protests were well conducted. They were handled by a very disciplined group of students, many of whom I knew, who came from, some of them from the religious community. They were Catholic kids, they were Protestant students, they were Jewish students, and they were very much involved in that campaign to protest continuing rights for students to express their political views and to also express their opposition to Vietnam, the protests, or the war that was beginning as early as the late 50s. So that was the nature of the protests, and I think generally I tend to miss those days because there was a great deal of idealism among the students. And there were sometimes they fragmented and they did their own things, and there were some sit-ins. I personally credit one very interesting faculty member by the name of Herbert Marcuse. I don't have a photograph of Dr. Marcuse, but he taught in the Revelle Humanities program. He was a distinguished philosopher who had spent 10 years at Brandeis University and came out to the campus and wrote a very interesting book that became kind of the Bible for the New Left, The One-Dimensional Man. And it was a critique of capitalism to some extent. And so the students really rallied behind Dr. Marcuse, and he loved the rallies. At the same time, he knew that students should be careful and not go too far, and so he'd be the first one to say to students if they had a sit-in Urey Hall, well, now you've accomplished your purpose, now let's move on. And they would tend to follow his advice, and that was extremely helpful. So I have a different point of view. There were some on faculty who really were very upset with Dr. Marcuse because he invited some protests from off campus. And when Dr. McGill was the chancellor, well, we had some angry people in the community because of all the unrest and that were going on the campuses of the University of California. And he enjoyed that recognition and didn't seem to be bothered at all about people writing critical letters in the Union Tribune.
You told me you had some photos describing Dr. Revelle's experiences after he left Harvard and had returned to UCSD. You mentioned some famous names, John Steinbeck, Dr. Seuss, for example. Can you tell me more about that?
Well, I can, and I would like to say something about that early period. Dr. Revelle had an extraordinary career. Even after he left the campus, he was still the emeritus professor at Scripps and continued to work very closely with many of the faculty at Scripps. He became involved at the Institute of Population Studies at Harvard. And there he worked with the United Nations and was an advisor to places like India and Pakistan for dealing with food problems and energy problems. Those were all issues that Roger was keenly aware of because he was one of the early people who raised the specter of global warming. And while he was at Harvard, by the way, Al Gore was an undergraduate student who took his course in global warming. And in his film, The Inconvenient Truth, former Vice President Gore pays tremendous tribute to Dr. Revelle. But we got to know Dr. Revelle very well during that period when he returned to the campus in 1975 till he passed away in 1991. And one of the interesting stories I would like to share with the viewers is the time that we started celebrating his birthday, which was March 7th every year in the Revelle Plaza. And he would often come to the plaza, and he loved these birthday parties that we held for him in the Revelle Plaza. We generally have a band, and we had food, and we had all kinds of things. But he would show up and give a little talk, and sometimes he would show up with the strangest thing. He had a yellow construction hat with a red revolving light on it. And students thought that was just great. And I took photographs of students with standing next to Dr. Revelle with this yellow hat. I just assumed that it was probably a groundbreaking that he had taken part in, and that's why he was wearing this hat. Finally, Mrs. Revelle came up, Ellen Revelle came up in 2008, long after Roger passed away, to celebrate this birthday that we have annually. And I asked her, I said, where did Dr. Revelle ever get this strange hat? And she is the first one to tell me that, well, John Steinbeck gave it to him. And I was just surprised. And I checked out with Dr. Walter Monk down at Scripps. And he said, no, it's absolutely true. What happened was that Life magazine sent John Steinbeck down to the campus, I think, sometime in January of 1961. And he was going to do a series of articles on ocean research, and particularly a project that was underway down at Scripps. And he went down, and Dr. Revelle and some of the faculty, Walter Monk among them, met with him, and I have a photograph of Dr. Revelle meeting with them on the ship. It was a big old barge that Roger and was able to acquire with several other ships at Scripps, and it was fitted to do ocean research, to do drilling. And while he was down at Scripps, Roger then invited John Steinbeck to go on this expedition down to off of Guadalupe Island, where 12,000 feet below the ocean floor, they dug huge cylinders that were brought up for determining what is the composition of that soil underneath the ocean floor, and particularly with regard to carbon dioxide and among other chemicals. And so he went down. It was a 2-week cruise, and there are articles that appear on the website in Google, among others, for the Scripps Institute of Oceanography, that you can read the article about this Project Mohole down in Mexico. And this was the beginning of a huge ocean drilling project down at Scripps that later took place. So, but anyway, that was one interesting story. And then this other thing was finding going out to the plaza and seeing this photograph, which I have of him standing with a group of students at his birthday party wearing this Steinbeck hat. So that was one interesting story that I never found out until 2008. And then there's one other story having to do with commencements. One of the nice things about the college system, the students, in addition to advising students and getting students involved very early in the campus in terms of leadership responsibilities, each college has its own graduation ceremony. And I'll never forget, in 1978, we had a student group at Revelle who every year would give advice about who to invite as a commencement speaker. And typically, the students would come out with some kind of outlandish things. They wanted to invite David Letterman or Henry Kissinger, and it was kind of not very realistic. But early in winter quarter of 1978, why they came up with the name of Ted Geisel, Dr. Seuss. And they wanted to invite Dr. Seuss as a commencement speaker. And at first, I wasn't sure that was a very good idea. So I do remember going over and talking to Dr. Revelle about the idea, and he thought it was a great idea, and says, by all means, try to invite him. So then I went back to see the provost at Revelle, June Tapp at the time, and I said, well, Dr. Revelle thinks that's a great idea. So she said, well, I'll get in touch with him. So she called Ted Geisel, and first he said, well, he wasn't sure at all, but he'd think about it. And a couple days later, he called back and said, well, yes, but I am not going to give a regular commencement talk. I'll try to write a poem for the graduating seniors. And it was one of the great commencements of all time. The sheer brevity of it, it took about 3 minutes at most. And I'll never, I don't think I've ever seen students stand up and applaud the way they did. Well, word got out that Dr. Seuss was going to give the commencement, and so students actually brought their Dr. Seuss books with them to the commencement. And I'm going to read the poem that he wrote for the students, if you don't mind. And it's very brief, and it was, as I say, an extraordinary poem. The poem, Dr. Seuss.
It's lovely.
And as I say, afterwards, we had a reception out in the Revelle Plaza, and Dr. Seuss came out, and he realized that the students had brought their books, and so we got together a little card table, And he sat down for about an hour and a half signing the books of the graduating seniors. Well, we've never had a commencement like that, and I don't think ever will. The next day, San Diego Union had a front page picture of this poem that I just read, and it was something that I have never forgotten. And so it's one of those extraordinary things that happened during that period.
We appreciate your speaking with us today, Ernie. Thanks. You must feel very satisfied to have played such a part in the founding of UCSD.
Well, it was a minor role in respect to Dr. York and Roger Revelle and this extraordinary faculty. It was a very minor role, and it's confined primarily to an undergraduate college. It was a great privilege, and it's one that I shared with students, the alumni of that early period. And they still have that wonderful sense of a respect for the type of campus we have. So it was a privilege for me, and I am profoundly grateful for that opportunity that I had. And thank you.